Hello there, my name's Philip Murphy and this is my presentation for Falmouth Theatre THE241 site-specific module based around loss and letting go through the lens of climate change. Or vice versa, actually. I'll have a look at that in a sec. Primarily throughout this module, my role was as a writer, dramaturge and musician. It's going to be the latter that I talk about primarily through this presentation. Throughout the performance we used music as a segue, as some kind of dialectic form of communicating an agenda, as well as in two locations it being purely for emotive response. Pardon me. So the primary example, I guess, of the way we use music within the performance was an adaptation of a song, an old Cornish folk song, that's called Drop of Nelson's Blood. And in the original version, there's verses and the refrain, and the verses go from things like having another pasty wouldn't do us any harm, another pint of ale wouldn't do us any harm. Typically, Cornish things not doing anyone any harm. And then the refrain saying, and we'll haul the old chariot along, just continue as normal. And we adapted that just very slightly. We changed the words from things like another pint of ale to chopping down the trees, or the rising of the seas wouldn't do us any harm. While keeping that refrain, and we'll haul the old chariot along. The intention for keeping the refrain the same was so that it would act as a metaphor of sorts, kind of a depiction of the way that we view climate change. We've known about it for a long time, and still very little effort's been made to change anything about it. Our responses as a society aren't sharp enough, and they're not quite there, even though we know that it's possibly one of the biggest issues that we currently face. The issue with that is because that's implicit, because it's a metaphor. We'll haul the old chariot along. It doesn't come across that way in a site-specific piece. In a studio where you can fill the space of metaphors and you can keep symbols and ideas constantly recurring, and then kind of ask the audience to dwell in an idea and then package it up for themselves at the end, that kind of thing will work. But in a site-based piece, it generally becomes lost in the sea or the sand, in the case of Gillen Vase Beach. Mostly, because there's a dog or there's a bird, and you just get distracted. You don't have time to really dwell in these metaphors, to really inhabit the ideas of the piece, because the ideas of the piece should be the space, and that's one of the failings of our piece as a whole. Because as a group we were quite confused as to the true definitions of site-specific, and we were confused as to what we really wanted to do as a group. Our method and our solutions actually became part of the problem. We decided to create the etudes, but the etudes were disconnected from each other. While they were linked by the fact that they were all essays in grief, they had no real kind of coherent narrative. There was nothing that an audience could engage with on a level other than this space, transition, this space, transition, this space, or this idea, transition, this idea. And so it didn't work as a coherent piece of theatre. One thing we did manage to do though quite well is segue between those etudes. Using this drop of Nelson's blood, we got everyone singing, everyone remained within the piece because they were joining in with the song, adding their voices to this collective, and then obviously that feeling of singing music together really creates a bond between people some kind of, like, some form of minor temporary community that was there for the performance and then gone afterwards. But another way we use the music, rather than just a segue or, as I mentioned, some kind of didactic method of explaining our things through, you know, chopping down the trees and the rising of the seas. Another way I used it was in order to create an emotive representation of text. So the best example I could probably give is Cat's Etude was about letting go, and if we ever really do, if even thinking about it means we're holding on, if trying to let go means we're holding on in some other aspect, whether we can ever lose anything that's made us who we are. And so in order to discuss the kind of the confusion and the perpetual nature of that issue, I created this. It's just a simple 5-chord motif. It starts on an E minor, and then it moves through 3 more major chords within the key of E minor before ending on an A major. And it's the A major that's the really interesting bit, because that's the part that makes it Dorian. Dorian is a mode used a lot in Cornish, Celtic, Gaelic folk music. It's used a lot in funk as well, but not really relevant. And what it does is it adds a slightly happy kind of tone to what's generally quite sad, the minor key. But because I have these 3 notes, which are actually an E minor chord, without having to do anything, is great. Because I have that E minor chord running over the whole thing, everything is within the context of E minor. So you have everything in relation to this sadness. The sadness is the foundation, it's the bulk, and then these are perspectives and contexts, ways of moving around this sadness. And I build it up towards hopefulness before bringing it back down again. Again, trying to represent this perpetual confusion towards loss and letting go, grief. Unfortunately, because music is an expression tool rather than a representational tool, I could have used that piece of music anywhere and it meant something totally different. I created it specifically for the piece of text that Kat was talking about, meaning that its context being tied to that makes it useful. Music on its own without anything else is expression. It seems to have meaning, it seems to have purpose, but that purpose is very much created by you, the listener. And then without a context, you know, it can be anything. So yeah, I created that piece of music to specifically fit that context, and it worked to an extent. A lot of people thought it was a very nice piece of music. Whether it had the specific feeling that I intended for it, I'm not entirely sure. But in terms of creating some form of emotive connection with that specific monologue or piece of text, it worked quite well. Yeah. In terms of, just discussing representational versus expressive. A lot of what I did during the module as well was turning the landscape into metaphors. I took the ideas of the sea and I discussed them through, you know, the tides of change, the storm that's passing, all these things around, you know, grief and loss, and through that I was able to create the last piece of text spoken within the performance, which goes something like, "Throw your stones beyond the break and see the ripples in their wake dissipate in the vast unending blue. And once your stones sink below, don't be sad or afraid, for the ripples they made were splendid to see, no matter how temporary." Those kinds of expressions, taking those metaphors from the sea and from the land, and then expressing them through the lens of grief, is something that I did throughout the whole module. It's something that became quite useful to me as a writing tool, and actually became somewhat of the methodology that we took upon. We would create an etude around the ideas of grief and then use metaphor in order to tie it to the landscape. Unfortunately, we never tied it down well enough. It could have been performed on any beach, really. Anywhere in Cornwall it would have worked. Because while we used the topographical kind of diversities of the space, we didn't necessarily tie anything explicitly to Falmouth. The closest thing we did was the packet ships. The packet ships being a really big and important part of Falmouth's history. But the packet ships delivered letters all over England. It wasn't specifically Falmouth, although it was a main port of call. It wasn't something that would tie it specifically just to Falmouth. And that's mostly because of our organisation, because of the way we made the work, because we were confused about site-specific, because we were confused about what it is we wanted from this performance. We created something that was a little bit disconnected. Everything relating to grief, because we were all in situations of grief at the time. Everything using metaphors of the space and the sea, the sand, all of it, but none of it really being concentrated into something that the whole group felt or knew, and none of it being concentrated into something that the community could really, really engage with on a level where they knew it. Not implicitly, what's the word? Intimately. There was no intimacy between our performance and the community, or the real space. Which is ultimately why I think the piece didn't work. Obviously we had a lot of very good points. A lot of people really enjoyed the characters, the sea captain. A lot of people really enjoyed the music. A lot of people really enjoyed the etudes. But it had, for me, it didn't have enough real substance. It wasn't really of the space enough, and we weren't creative enough in getting our real feelings and our real intentions across within the performance. And it's a shame to say, but I think that's the way it went, and I think that actually it's a positive being able to reflect on it in that way for any other site-specific pieces that I might do in the future. So yeah, it's not all bad. Thank you very much for your time, and I'll hopefully see you soon.